So today we're going to be talking about climate finance, which is a big topic in JYCM and Hazon and the Jewish youth climate movement world in general. And so to begin with a few basics, we can discuss investment in fossil fuels. Investment in fossil fuels is undertaken by banks, by asset managers, by universities, organizations, companies, corporations, any large institution that wants to generate income by investing in something that it deems successful and profitable, even if that something is not sustainable. In this case, it's fossil fuels, it's oil and gas companies, it's the companies that are damaging our environment and making, right now, communities on the front lines have an incredibly difficult time surviving, let alone thriving, and soon will affect the entire globe. And Eliza can talk she can talk about BlackRock, our BlackRock action, which took place in October in time for the Shmita Year of the month, which was economics and climate finance.
Yeah, so BlackRock is an asset manager, which basically means that they exist as a corporation to take investments that both individuals and businesses take money that individuals and businesses want to be invested, and they invest that money for them. And BlackRock has a portfolio of $9.5 trillion, which is a little bit hard to wrap your head around that much money. It's pretty much the size of the economy of many, many European countries put together. Quite a lot of money, and a good portion of that money is in fossil fuels, which is obviously extremely harmful. So JYCM has been active in pushing BlackRock to divest their holdings from fossil fuels, including, as Sarah mentioned, in October we were one of the leaders of a protest along with Green Faith at BlackRock headquarters in New York City. It was a intergenerational Jewish action against, or not against, but calling on the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, to stand in line with our shared Jewish values and divest from fossil fuels.
So, as Eliza mentioned, investments in fossil fuels are extremely hazardous to our environment and to communities, and our BlackRock action was one notable instance of us protesting that and demanding that corporations take action and divest from fossil fuels on a large scale. But what does divestment mean? What does it actually look like? So, divestment, as it sounds, is the opposite of an investment. It means getting rid of stocks and bonds and investment funds that are unethical and morally ambiguous, and in our case, hazardous to the climate and to the environment. When you invest your money, you might buy stocks, you might buy bonds or other investments that generate income for you, and corporations do this on a much larger scale that helps them function as a network. And divestment means taking very big, very bold action against this sort of investment in fossil fuels. More small-scale, short-term, and conservative approaches like carbon taxing and cap and trade, they can only achieve so much before we have to actually implement systemic change. And divestment from fossil fuels is exactly that. It's not a makeshift fix for a problem. It's a sustainable and enduring solution. And that's what we want to see. We want to see a sustainable and an enduring solution that whole cities, whole countries, and the entire globe uses to break ties with oil and gas companies that are harming the planet. So now we are going to move into a discussion of Shmita and what Shmita is. So Shmita is a 7-year cycle for economic and environmental justice. And Eliza can explain a little bit more about what it meant thousands of years ago and perhaps what it can mean for us today.
Okay, yeah. Awesome. So basically, if you aren't familiar with the concept of Shemitah, Um, Shmita is a 7-year cycle that's outlined in the Torah, and what it calls for a number of things, but um, basically it calls for a rest of the land, Sabbath of the land, if you will. I explain it to some of the middle schoolers that I teach this to as a mega Shabbat, so you can think about it that way if that makes sense to you. And we're going to read some texts that explain what it means, but it includes letting the land rest and holding land in common and releasing debts, sort of the themes that we're going to be talking about today. I don't want to spoil because we're about to get into it. And as we get into these texts, I do also want to mention that we have Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein here with us today, and I'll let him introduce himself, but he's going to help be a rabbinic interpreter for us tonight during this program. So yeah, I'll let him introduce himself.
Thank you, Eliza. Thank you, Sarah. Really, the Big Bold Jewish Climate Festival and also Big Bold Jewish Youth Climate Movement, the work that you do. And so it's a pleasure to be here with each of you. I serve as Rabbinic Scholar and Public Affairs Advisor at JFNA. And I'm also grateful to be here with the other co-founder of the Jewish Youth Climate Movement, Liana Rothman. Thank you.
All right, so our first handful of texts are just general overviews of what Shmita is as a practice, and then we can zoom in on Shmita in its relationship with economics and climate finance. So we want to make this an interactive experience, and if anyone would like to unmute to read aloud the first source, please feel free. I'm sure we can figure out how to unmute you.
I can start. 6 years you may sow your land and gather in its produce, but in the 7th year you shall release it and abandon it. The poor of your land shall eat it, and what they leave over the beasts of the field shall eat. So shall you do in your vineyard and your olive trees. Should I continue?
We can pause there and reflect a little bit. So, what do you think, everyone? Why do you think the nature of this cyclical practice is so effective? What about it occurring every 7 years and for a full year makes it productive, makes it sustainable, makes it attractive to the Jewish community?
Feel free to share in the chat, or if you want to come off mute and briefly say something, that is also good as well.
It imitates the weekly cycle of work and rest.
Yes, for sure. There is a clear parallel between Shabbat, not working for 6 days of the week, and then working for 6 days of the week, and then resting for the 7th. And the Shmita practice, not toiling the land for 6 years and then resting, allowing the land to rest for the 7th year.
Something that I first and foremost, I always love how much Torah that JYCM brings to everything that you do, and I know that you have the Shmita campaign that you're also engaging with. Something that I think about with this first text is kind of the context and where it's located in the Torah, like after being enslaved in Mitzrayim in Egypt for 400 years, and then Sinai, and it's just an interesting. I just wonder about that in the chronology of the Torah, how we find Shmita seated, really right after a liberation story.
I'll jump in and say I think that's such a really interesting comment on having Shmita after a liberation story, thinking about how we want to use how we as a movement are pursuing climate justice in a really anti-oppressive way. And we see it as historically the next level of anti-oppressive work in the fight against white supremacy, in the fight against colonialism, even the fight against anti-Semitism, in the fight for democracy. How the fight against, right, we're talking about right now, which is corporate capitalism and economic injustice, and how it's really about liberating people. And the climate crisis is far more than a horrific problem, a major opportunity to really transform society. So I think it's such a cool parallel that we can see today as well.
Yeah, I can just say one more thing, and then if nobody has anything else to add, we can move on. But I think that, the way that Judaism not only has this cycle of rest built in, but that it's like a commandment, something that you have to do, I think, is very interesting and prescient, especially, now we sort of alluded to this, and as Madeline said, the climate crisis is so deeply tied to capitalism and, produce, extract. And so obviously, at a rate that is unsustainable and can't be continued. And so the fact that Judaism calls for deliberate and repetitive rest for humans and for land, I think it's very interesting. And we also know that those are not separate things, and that they are very intertwined with each other.
I'm wondering, what do you all think of that? What do you think of the distinction between a practice that might be optional? There are certainly a number of those in Judaism, and this practice which is mandated for us to fulfill. We must observe the Shmita Year according to the Torah. Obviously, in a capitalist system, giving back to the poor, letting the land rest, all of these aren't obligated of the individual. In fact, you could even argue they're discouraged. And so that often leads to immoral and destructive behavior in a capitalist structure. So, well, do you think the Shmita Year is compatible in a capitalist structure? And do you think the distinction between a practice that is obligated and one that is optional is key here? And sort of your reflections on those two questions. Anybody want to jump in? Yeah, Judy, can you unmute?
Yeah, our ideas about what's good are based on more. The more you have, the better you do. The richer you are, the better off you are, the more successful you are, that's all good. If you are lazy or take time off for yourself or for your family or for the people who work with you or for you, for the land, that's called, there's just no value for that in our society. And in the biblical society, apparently there was.
Yes, definitely. I think it's almost a scary idea, because this capitalist ideology has been ingrained in all of us. It pervades every corner, every crevice of society. And so for us to envision a world in which we're not constantly adding to our supply, we're not constantly producing, we're not constantly hustling, we're allowing the land to rest, we're allowing ourselves to rest, and we're giving back what we've accumulated and allocating that to other people who deserve it, who need it. I think it's a scary sort of thought, but it's also a very comforting one, because everyone is cared for in that world, not just, a small upper echelon of people. Yeah, Rhea, correct me if I'm saying that incorrectly.
Rhea, yes, thank you. Yeah, I remember first learning about Shmita and about the debt forgiveness, as well as letting land lie fallow, and thinking like that was just so radical. And at first, being raised in Western society, I was thought, well, does that mean people are just going to borrow money and know that they'll have their debts forgiven in 7 years and no one will ever be accountable, or what, but then I thought more about it and practiced it in my own community garden and tried to do it, tried other practices for Shmita Year 7 years ago, and could kind of start to let go of what I had originally learned and accept that this could be a really rejuvenating practice. But it did go against a lot of things that had become ingrained in me. But another matter that I don't know if you're planning to discuss here is that my understanding is biblically, this really just applies to agriculture in Israel. And it has recently taken hold in like the broader Jewish community and the diaspora. And I think it is, or I've heard a lot of interpretations that it really is optional in the rest of the world. Just in Eretz Yisrael, that you have to, that it's really, I guess, necessary. So I found that interesting.
Yeah, Steve, you want to jump in?
Yeah, this is probably way beyond where I go, but I'm going to ask my colleague, Rabbi Isaiah, to help me here a bit, because one of the things I think about is Leviticus 25 and the celebration of the Jubilee on the 50th year, and how that all incorporates in the Shmita. And I just don't know. So I'd like to connect the dots, if there is a dot to connect in this. So if anybody can add to that, or Isaiah, if you can help me on the, understanding that, I'd, be much appreciated.
Well, one thing, I'll pass it over to my colleagues, Sarah and Eliza, on this one, but one thing that I have been moved and impressed by is if you look at their Mari Makomos, or their source sheet of all the Jewish texts, I think there's a good 15 pages plus that has been put together. But on the note of the Leviticus text, I would be curious also, I know that we have a few more Jewish texts that we plan on speaking to, and one of them is Leviticus, correct? So I think we are going towards that one. And you mentioned the Jubilee, the Yovel, and debt forgiveness. Yes, I believe our presenters today will be getting to those points in just a moment. But I think it is a really important point to be reminded, right, that there's different texts and different layers to how we understand the concept and the topic.
Yes, definitely. And to Judy's point, yes, according to many interpretations, Shmita is only necessary in Eretz Yisrael, not anywhere else. And that's similar to other agricultural practices like Orla and Truma and Maaser. But at JYCM, we like to use the framework of Shmita, not necessarily, to pinpoint every detail and to ensure that we're adhering to every interpretation of where it is and isn't obligatory. Not that that isn't valuable, but our focus is more so on how it applies to the environment and to climate finance, and it's more so like a framework or a blueprint or a template that we use, that we're using currently in our Shmita campaign. We can tell you a little bit about that if you're interested. So essentially, we have been running this approximately year-long campaign called the Shmita campaign that is using the Shmita practice the Shmita cycle as a framework for our actions and our programming and our teach-ins and workshops. And every month has a different theme or a different midah. And on October, as we mentioned, it was the economic system and climate finance. One is going to be time. There's equity and justice, there's food and agriculture, all of these motifs in the Shmita practice that are really important to note and really important to analyze. And to Steve's point, yes, I think the fact that Shmita is both a year-long practice that happens every 7 years, and then after the 49th year, there's this big jubilee. I think that's something to investigate as well, and something very valuable, and we see that happen often in Jewish practices, and the meaning behind it is key. And we're getting to the Leviticus source now, so if anyone wants to read it, that would be wonderful, so we can go ahead and move along.
I could read it if no one else wants to. It's Mimi.
Oh yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
And Moses took the book of the covenant and read so the people could hear. And they said, all that God has spoken, we will do. We will obey. Rabbi Yishmael asked, from where did Moshe begin to read? When you settle the land shall observe a Sabbath of the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, but in the 7th year, the land shall have a complete rest. Do you want me to read more, or does someone else want to take over?
Feel free to read the whole thing.
Okay, Shmita, Yovel, blessings and curses. And how did he conclude? These are the laws, statutes, and teachings. They said, we accept. When he saw that they had received it upon themselves, he said, behold, you are prepared. Tomorrow come and receive all the laws upon yourself. I can't pronounce the rest of it.
So for this text, what's coming up for everyone? For me, it's that Shmita is obviously emerging as the core of the Torah, as a very powerful practice, but more so, it's also emerging as the heart of our Jewish identity. And I was wondering, what do you guys think that looks like for Shmita to be so pertinent to what it means to be Jewish and to be a part of the Jewish community? And do you think that's something we can either directly apply to society today or model today?
One thing that strikes me about this text, and it goes back to a different point that was made about whether the laws of Shmita apply, whether you're in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, or whether also around the world, and also how we are adapting the values and how we integrate that into broader society. This text here is pointing to the fact that at Sinai, this was the law that was being given. And so if it's only for the land of Israel, why are we getting this law here? Why now? Like tell me about it when we're going to get there. So, okay, one response is all the laws were given. And so there were many laws given that were only for when they would actually arrive to the Makom Asher Yibchar Shemo Sham, right? The place where God would say, let's in Shemo Sham, to put God's name, Jerusalem, essentially. But here also it's a future law. And I remember hearing a commentator that says that when they heard this law and they recognized they would have their own land, and that not only they would have a place to rest, but that the land would also have a place to rest, they said, yes. Like, and like, oh, you're telling me our future will be secure, we'll have food enough where we could give it the land a rest as well, like Dayenu, like we're in, you know? Like that's enough. Nasa v'nishma. So it goes back to the liberation piece too, the sense of being able to rest your shoulders and that the land should rest its shoulders, you know?
Should we move on to the next slide?
Yeah, I'm noticing something Ariel said in the chat, that a key piece is debt relief and providing food for the people and animals. It seems important to do now. Yeah, when we talk about land rest and letting the land rest, it doesn't necessarily mean just the physical land. It can also mean the produce of the land and the people that are relying on that produce, and allowing the workers and allowing the animals and allowing everyone who has a connection to the land to rest. So it's a system of it's a sabbatical system. It's not just allowing the terrain or the ground itself to rest. So I think that's a very key point to make. And in the last source, we saw also that it's not just a Sabbath of the land, it's a Sabbath of the Lord. So that speaks to the spiritual aspect of this rest and how it's rooted in not only our beliefs about social justice, but our beliefs about faith and connection to God. And now we can begin to discuss more in depth about debt and community responsibility and the relationship between Shmita and climate finance. So if anyone would like to read this next source from Deuteronomy, please feel free to unmute. Yeah, Paul.
Paul, I'm not sure we hear you. Are we hearing Paul?
I'm not hearing Paul.
Paul, maybe we could grab you for the next one.
All right, yeah, so I'll read this one, Paul. If you want to jump in for the next, that would be great. So every 7th year, you shall practice remission of debts. This shall be the nature of the remission. Every creditor shall remit the due that he claims from his fellow. He shall not dun his fellow or kinsman, for the remission proclaimed is of the Lord.
Should we do both of these together?
Yeah, sure.
I can do the next one. Okay. If, however, there is a needy person among you, one of your kinsmen in any of your settlements in the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kinsman. Rather, you shall open your hand and lend him sufficient for whatever he needs. Beware lest you harbor the base thought, the 7th year, the year of remission, is approaching, so that you are mean to your needy kinsman and give him nothing. He will cry out to the Lord against you, and you will incur guilt. Give to him readily and have no regrets when you do so. For in return, the Lord your God will bless you in all your efforts and in all your undertakings. For there will never cease to be needy ones in your land, which is why I command you, open your hand to the poor and needy kinsmen in your land.
So anything popping up for anyone? For me, this connects directly to what I believe Judy was saying earlier. This accounts for creditors who might just try to evade the practice by not making loans, for example. I think the Shmita practice itself, it covers all of the loopholes in a very seamless way, which I think is beautiful, but also it relies on the trust between individuals and the good faith and the humanity and the honesty of the individual themselves. So it's a practice that has sort of a safety net, but it's also a practice that relies on the individual to be their best self. And I think that demand is very key to what we should expect today of every member of the Jewish community and the global community. Steve, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I do. And, part of all this and what I'm hearing, and you actually, started off with your, when you started talking about, in this session about BlackRock. And, they have so much money that that they have to invest in all that. And I think the underlying theme of all this, as well as what Ariel put forward as well, is sustainability. And BlackRock definitely focuses a lot on that in terms of how they're trying to invest, in this space. And so I just see it as an underlying theme of Shmita is sustainability. And so even though we rest for a year after, on the 7th year, is to maintain that stability and sustainability. And in terms of impact investing and how we deal with climate and the other sustainable development goals that are out there, that seems to be an underlying theme here, and I just wanted to bring that out.
Definitely, yes. Sustainability has been a hot topic lately in social media and climate organizations, but it's also rooted in very historical, ancestral practices like Shmita. It's just not the word that's often associated with it. But that's exactly what Shmita is attempting. It's attempting to rejuvenate the Jewish people, prepare them for 6 more years of success, and make sure that everybody is included in that success. It's a great way to recharge, to revitalize, and to grow as a community. And I see the chat is popping up, but as we read those, Penelope, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just am always like so amazed whenever I read this stuff, because like I guess we've been saying, like, it's so radical, at least like in the world today. Like this is like, when I read it, it like feels very clearly very leftist, like anti-capitalist, like against, like it's about like freeing debts. It feels like it's like reparations and like restorative justice and all of that, and like against just like endless growth and emphasis on profit and all of that. And that's just so cool that that was being talked about like thousands of years ago, because it kind of like gives me hope that like this is like the moment of economic system that we're in right now. It hasn't always been that way, and like we can return to this system where like we're in communities where we like look out for each other and make sure that we're all free, and that it isn't just about growing, it's about like connecting. And that's just super cool. And I know I don't really read it literally, like I'm not a farmer, I'm not like like all that kind of stuff. It's more just like we were saying, like a framework. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And there's this one line in the text that particularly sticks out to me, and it's common throughout the entirety of the Torah, and that's not hardening your heart and opening your hand, not shutting your hand. And I think, this applies in one-on-one relationships between people, making sure that you're vulnerable and inviting people into your space. But it can also happen on a systems basis, excuse me. You can invite people into your home and into your community and provide for them. And I think that framework of not hardening your heart and not shutting your hand is really beautiful.
Amen. And Sarah, what's interesting, not hardening your heart, not closing your hand, that line is what the rabbis highlight as the line that we use to that is the rooted source for the mitzvah of charity, of tzedakah. If you look at the Code of Jewish Law, 1,500 years later, they quote this line to talk about different laws relating to charity, philanthropy, tzedakah, giving.
All right. I think we have a few more people that wanted to mention something. I know Judy, you've had your hand up for a while, and then Shane as well.
Okay, thank you. When it says you shall not harden your heart and shut your hand and not calculate, the Shemitah is coming up or the Yovel is coming up. I'm not going to lend because I won't get it back. The Israelite, even in biblical times, they had the same nasty thoughts of self-advancement that we have now. And where the impulse to write all this in Deuteronomy comes from is really amazing, that this value would have been held, even though from everything I've read, Shemitah was very unpopular in Israel, and the rabbis were at great pains to find ways around it. Because when you don't sow and you don't reap, you don't have a lot to eat. Life is really tough. And so to do this is a big sacrifice, and it's for a very idealistic goal. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Shane, do you want to quickly say something, and then I think we'll move on to our next couple of texts?
Yeah, I first just want to say, sorry, I had my camera off. I'm like being written in the I'm seeing what's being written in the chat and what like Penelope was saying, and now what Judy was just saying. And I think like this may be a very like idealistic idea, very idealistic concept, but at the same time, I think it does what a lot of like ideas with regards to like alternative economic systems cannot do, and that it manages to be like quite radical and progressive, like for our current way we think about things. But at the same time, it's not like burn it all down. It's not so radical to the point where it could never be achieved. Like I think like it's a significant change from the current, corporate dominated neoliberal capitalist society that we have right now. But it's not saying, abolish capitalism, let's have a revolution. It existed in a time before all these ideologies exist, and therefore I think it's resistant to dogmatism in a way that a lot of these other policies aren't. And I think this policy or this concept exists in such a way that it could exist in a variety of different like settings and places and different economic systems. Like you could have it take place in a place like America in the future, where you still have, some of the current situations that we have here still surviving, like not requiring total change, but where you're also, changing enough that it is sustainable, it is equitable, and is fair to everybody by implementing something along these lines.
Definitely.
That was really wonderful. I'll just chime in really fast and say I think also one of the things that makes really grounded in reality is it's really just about priorities. Who are we saying? What in our society do we think is our priority? We can say things like, when I hear in the climate crisis, there's a lot of context people say, well, simply we just can't change our economic paradigms, but it wouldn't be sustainable as a civilization and as a society. But we're letting our planet be destroyed, and we're letting so many people be worked or be left behind and jobless and incapable of living and paying their bills and having healthcare, and so many problems economically. And so that's not sustainable either. We know we are living in an unsustainable system, and it cannot function. It's not functioning. So when saying we can't do anything else or society won't function, that's saying we have a society that is broken. We're choosing to perpetuate one form of it And because we can think the society would be broken if we didn't, but because of that system, society is already broken. So it's a certain myopia, it's a certain nearsightedness. And Shmita says, let's look at our own priorities here. Who are we prioritizing the well-being of? It's people and it's earth, and it's the connection between the two.
Yes. To Shane's point, it's not necessarily burning down the house. It's not, tweaking a pipe here and there. I like to think of it as just rebuilding the house with new materials. And I think that sort of frame of mind allows for us to make radical change, but change that is sustainable and that will be lasting. And that's what we're looking for. We're not looking for something that will upheave the system and then crash and burn followingly, but we're looking for something that will meticulously and thoughtfully rework the system with Jewish principles in mind. And I think Jewish principles account for the threat of something not being sustainable, especially when it comes to the Shmita practice. So thank you, Shane. Thank you, Penelope. Thank you, everyone who contributed. I think we're going to move on to our next source. So this source is about ownerless-ness, and that is a pretty key theme with Shmita. Does anybody want to read this brief source? Yeah, Shane, go ahead.
When the produce of the sabbatical year is sold, it should not be sold by measure, nor by weight, nor by number, so that it will not appear that one is selling produce in the sabbatical year. Instead, one should sell a small amount by estimation to make it known that the produce is ownerless, and the proceeds of the sale should only be used to purchase other food. Rambam, Mishneh Torah, Hilchot Shmita Year 6.3.
Yeah. So this source in particular is more so about being very confident that ownerless-ness is ensured during the execution of Shmita, but the question of ownerless-ness is brought up and is centered here. So my first question for everyone is, why is ownerless-ness so important, and why are we trying so hard to make sure that it is consistent throughout every execution of Shmita?
One thing that I think about is on the note of Shabbat, as Eliza, as we shared earlier, about how Shemitah is like Shabbat for the land in a way, and thinking in the Shabbat concept that the time is holy, and that also then the land becomes holy, the food that grows becomes holy, and things that are holy. I mean, it's a part of the concept is, where does it come from? We as humans, right? What role do we play in the creation? Yes, there's a combined force of being partners with the creator, right? To create. And I think Rav Kook, who really brought back for us, first chief rabbi of Israel, then called Palestine, and also really said that not as we as humans work the land works us. But this idea that because it's holy, that the proceeds from the food, what happens to that money? It becomes holy. And what can I do only with holy money? Put it back towards holiness. So this concept of holiness leads to holiness is something I think about too here. And I wonder if, like, that which is sacred, who's the owner of that which is sacred? It's a collective ownership, it's ownerless or collective ownership. Something I'm thinking about.
Does it talk about anonymity when you say ownerless? I'm a little confused about that, this passage.
My understanding of the way it's used here is that one of the lines, as you referenced, I believe, Steve, earlier about Leviticus, where God says, "Ki li kol haaretz," the land is mine, right? This idea that, and going back to equity and also equality, like really creating a baseline. For 6 years, it could get a little out of control. Some people end up advancing in other ways, and other people don't have the same ability to advance in other ways. And agricultural, being economic, being connected to the pieces that Sarah and Eliza already brought to us. I think it's that reminder. It's about power. It's about hierarchy. It's about leveling the playing field, I believe, when that sentence.
Yeah, I wanna go to some other people quickly, but something to think about is what we consider now to be ownerless or maybe public goods. Our parks, or on many different scales, like your local park or your national park, and that's just like earth. Like you pick up a rock or something, you're like not like, oh, these rocks are only mine, and then these rocks over here are, it's just like a rock, it's part of the earth, right? And so when we think about fossil fuels, like what are they except also rock formations and like decomposed fossil fuels in earth, and the vast majority of people don't want these resources being used to destroy the earth and destroy each other. And why are these our shared home, parts of our shared home, being used to profit at the expense of others? I think that is interesting. I want to go to Penelope and Mimi, since they both haven't talked in a little bit.
Yeah, I've never read this passage, but I think it's really interesting, and it kind of makes me think about the fact that I guess just to have something not be owned, it really takes the emphasis off of the material possessions of an individual, and taking when we think about how we value an individual, it isn't about how much they own. In this passage, it seems to say we should value them for other things rather than just what they're worth, because that isn't really the important thing. It's about just based on the other passages, the connection to community and the land, and how much they're helping people. It isn't it kind of takes I feel in our society there's a lot of emphasis on the individual, and your only value is based on your material possessions, and this seems to go beyond that.
I was just going to say, it reminds me of how I think it was in Britain in the Middle Ages, there was the idea of the commons, that there were certain things that everybody owned that no one could own, like the water and certain parts of the land, and that in a way this is sort of like a calendar-based commons of reminding Jews that they were a part of the Jewish people, and that their responsibility to each other was more important than whatever piece of land they had been able to claim or buy.
Yes, that is a very important point to keep in mind. And I don't know if we're going to have time, but we had a very interesting source about how not only should all material possessions be considered ownerless-ness, you can't trace the object to a possessor, but also when an exchange is occurring, the debtor should not feel in debt. In fact, they should feel as if they are giving a gift to the creditor. And if that feeling isn't organically inspired, it should be encouraged by the creditor, So even just not in the interaction itself, but in the emotions that the interaction sort of emits, the feeling should not be one of guilt or regret or owing someone something. It should be one of collaboration and camaraderie and affection and care. It should be one that accounts for the other, not just the self and what the self has in their possession. And I think that's a very valuable point to keep in mind as well, that it's not just the interaction that we're examining, it's also what the interaction means and the connotations of the interaction. I'm not sure what your name is because it says Madeline Canfield, but if you want to jump in for a second, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. It's interesting to hear everyone's interpretation. I guess I'm looking at this as a little bit more prosaic, is to say that you're not supposed to be selling the produce of the field during Shemitah, but what happens if you glean more from the field, or you go into somebody's field and you take more than you can use, or you go in at night and you just grab everything? It's saying it is not up to you to sell that to someone else because it was not yours to begin with. You should essentially, the proceeds of the sale should only be used to purchase other food. So it's not, so just operationally, just again, not high-mindedness, but saying, how do you deal with a market? Because you have people who have food, people who don't have food, but it's Shemitah, so that they're not growing it for sale in the market. So how do you think of the transaction and the exchange between people who have in need? And so I think in that sense, this text to me is just is much more simple and straightforward in saying, how does that exchange happen during that year?
Yes, the operational basics are important as well. And there was something Eliza mentioned in the chat that I just want to emphasize. Ownerless-ness and these sorts of exchanges can also mean returning what you have unrightfully taken or stolen. And that relates directly to Indigenous rights and our acknowledgement of the land that we're using, the land that we're exploiting. So thank you, Eliza, for dropping that in the chat. I think we're going to have to skip the next few texts that we had planned, but I'm sure we can send you resources, or you can find them through JYCM. We have so many toolkits and so many sources for you to peruse and to have discussions about in your communities. And there are a lot of ways to get involved. You can sign on to the Shmita principles that are part of our Shmita campaign. These are commitments that we are encouraging Jewish institutions and Jewish individuals to make, so that by 2050 or by a certain year, we meet all of our ambitious goals in terms of lowering carbon emissions and divesting from fossil fuels and ensuring that the environment and all people are cared for. You can donate to JYCM if that's an option. If you are a young person or you have young people in your life, you can either create a kavutza or you can guide the creation of a kavutza. Kavutza is basically JYCM's version of a national chapter. I believe right now we have 38. Madeline, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but we have 38 nationally, and I believe one in Canada. And these kavutza are working on a local level to flourish JYCM's mission and to ensure that JYCM and youth climate activism is appearing nationwide and is building momentum for our movement. And if we have any upcoming actions, you can check those out on our website and on our calendar. And we just want to thank you so much for coming to this session. We've had a wonderful time learning with you and studying these important texts and this important practice alongside you. And we hope to see you in the future at another event. Thank you so much.